Every day when I open the newspaper, there seems to be about one or two articles about the advances of artificial intelligence. Some of them are quite positive, exciting new developments, but I would say the majority are actually quite negative and talk about sort of existential risks to the human race. I think there's always been one thing that we felt that artificial intelligence surely couldn't be able to do, which is to match creativity of the human species. In some ways, I think that creativity is the unique realm of the human, somehow expresses what it means for us to be human. I think I've always used it myself as a kind of protective shield against why I think that artificial intelligence will never be able to do what I do. I'm a mathematician, and some people would say, well, surely mathematics is going to be the first thing that artificial intelligence will be able to do. After all, isn't code just algorithms? Algorithms is basically equations and mathematics. So artificial intelligence is doing mathematics whenever it does anything that it does. So surely artificial intelligence will be very good at being a mathematician. I think partly this goes to the heart of the fact that people misunderstand what being a mathematician is really about. I think most people, when I talk to them who aren't mathematicians, think that what I'm doing in my office in Oxford all day is sort of long division to lots of decimal places. And certainly if that was true, I'd have been put out of a job by a computer years ago. But I think that mathematics is actually much more creative. It requires lots of leaps into the unknown. Being a mathematician is a bit like being a storyteller, where my characters are kind of numbers and geometry, and therefore, being a storyteller requires making a lot of choices about what I think will excite my audience, what excites me. It's a very emotional reaction, and that's why I think creativity is really something which is at the heart of being a mathematician, and is why I always thought that artificial intelligence would really never be able to do what I do. It can calculate very fast, but can't really create the mathematical stories that I do. But I think I had to kind of change my view a little bit a few years ago when I saw what I regard as really the first instance of computer creativity. And this was in the context of a game. In 2016, DeepMind developed a piece of code that they believed could play a very sophisticated game, a game that was traditionally thought very hard to write code to play. This is the ancient Chinese game of Go. It's played on a 19 by 19 grid. You put black and white stones down on the grid, and the idea is just to try and surround more territory on the board than your opponent is. But this was a very difficult game to write code for, because it was very hard for Go players to sort of articulate why they were making certain moves. In chess, for example, which we very successfully created code to play at a very high level in the 1990s, somehow you could follow through the logical implications of moves. And so it was very much more attuned to the way a computer was thinking. But in Go, a player relies much more on visual recognition of patterns that are building up on the board. And that computer vision was always something that was a real difficult thing to write code to be able to achieve. And so that ability to look for patterns on the board seemed to protect Go from being able to have an algorithm that could play it at any high level. But a few years ago, the way we've been writing code has really changed. And I think this is why we're in such an exciting period, and perhaps dangerous period, for the impact of artificial intelligence on the world. I think artificial intelligence has been around since Turing wrote his first papers about trying to think how code and machines might replicate human intelligence. But we've talked about many decades of AI winters where nothing really has happened and all that hope and hype hasn't been realised. But I think we've really moved from AI winters into an AI heat wave. And the reason we've made this shift is because of a different style of coding that has been very effective in doing things that traditionally we couldn't do in the past on machines. In the past, code was written in a very top-down manner. A human would write instructions, then a machine would implement these instructions and at speed and at depth that a human couldn't achieve, so I could do calculations that I could never do in my head or even on paper. But somehow the instructions were still in the control of the human. The human wrote those instructions, and so anything that was produced by that code, for example, a piece of music or a painting or a piece of writing, in some sense you could still say, well, that's the creativity of the human that wrote those instructions, which the machine just blindly implemented. But a few years ago, we started to write code in a very different manner, in a sort of bottom-up manner, where we write code which then is exposed to data, and its interaction with that data means that the code can mutate, change, become something new, change the parameters inside the code to be more effective at the task that it's trying to do. For example, playing the game of Go, you write some instructions to let it to start playing and experimenting, but every time it loses, it updates the code and sees, what changes in parameters would have meant that I would have won that game had I played it again. So this is called machine learning, deep learning, some phrases that now I think a lot of the public have heard, thanks to all of these articles in the newspaper. But this style of coding really allows a possibility of something quite new to happen, because it means that as the code learns and changes, it starts to move away from what the human originally wrote. So there's a possibility, I think, of new things to appear out of this learning process, and actually for something that we might call the creativity of the code rather than the human who originally coded it, because the code, almost like a child, the child is born, has the DNA of its mother and father, yet through its exposure to the environment of the world around it, it starts to change and express itself in very different ways from the parent. And so, Picasso's creativity, we don't credit as being the creativity of the parent anymore. We say it's individually Picasso's creativity. I think we're starting to see the same thing with machine learning, that the code is changing, mutating, becoming something so different from its parent, the person who originally started that code, that we might start to see genuinely new things appearing, which is very exciting and maybe a little bit frightening too. And we certainly saw this in the code that was written to play the game of Go, because DeepMind felt that this learning process had developed code that could play at a very high level. Interestingly, it started on human games, but then ran out of those and then started making synthetic games, sort of started playing itself, and then choosing the code that was kind of winning over all of the other ones. And when it then came to play Lee Sedol, who's the kind of world champion at the game of Go, Lee Sedol was actually very dismissive of this code. He'd never seen code playing Go at anything like the high level that he played, even amateur level. But he was very shocked when, after 5 games, he emerged the other side of this match, having lost 4 games to 1. And he now says that one game that he did win, he now regards as actually the most important game of his whole career that he won. So I suppose we're not so surprised by machines doing things like beating us at games. After all, we saw that with Garry Kasparov and chess. I think for me what was the really exciting thing was something that happened in the second game of that match. Lee Sedol had lost the first game and realised actually this was a very powerful piece of code. But in the second game, Lee Sedol had made his move 36, and then it was up to AlphaGo to make move 37. Lee Sedol actually was quite exhausted by this stage, went up to the top of the hotel in Seoul where they were playing to smoke a cigarette. I think we humans still need sort of nicotine to stimulate our creative juices. The program sat and thought and then suggested a move which actually a human player still had to pick up the stones to put them on the board. This little bit of kit here, robotics still hasn't quite matched what evolution has developed for humans. So the human put the stone on the board, but the thinking was the thinking of the code. Now, I was watching these matches live on YouTube, and I remember the shock that the commentators had when they saw the move, because the move was traditionally a very weak move, and the commentators all gasped and said, "Oh, what a terrible move. Lee Sedol should be able to win the game from this point." Because traditionally, Go players are taught to play on the kind of outer 4 rows of the 19 by 19 grid, and anything further into the board early on in the game is regarded as quite a weak move. Lee Sedol came down from his cigarette break and saw this move and was also very surprised, but was a little bit suspicious because he's already learnt some respect for this code, having lost the first game. And he thought for a while, but just couldn't see what the point of this move was, this supposedly rather weak move. But by the end of the game, competition began to emerge for territory building up from the bottom right-hand corner of the board. And it turned out that that move 37 that AlphaGo, the name of the code, had made early on in the game was actually crucial to AlphaGo controlling that huge swathe of territory late on in the game. And actually, that move is regarded now as the one that won AlphaGo the second game in this match with Lee Sedol. So this, I think, was the exciting moment for me, and what I regard as actually an example of computer creativity. Because I rather like a definition by Margaret Bowden of what we should regard as something that is creative. Actually quite a hard word to pin down, I think. But she suggested it should pass 3 tests. Something should be called creative if it's novel. So I think novelty is something we can judge quite objectively against what we've seen already. It should be surprising, and it should have value. Now, those last 2 are quite interesting because they're quite subjective in quality. Surprise is about engaging our emotions, so it's something to do with being human, our emotional world. Value, what we value can change from different parts of the world, different moments in history. But for me, I think this move 37 does pass those 3 tests. It's a new sort of move. It surprised everyone because everyone thought it was a terrible move. Yet ultimately, AlphaGo was able to show it had value because it won AlphaGo the game. And I think games are quite a nice place to test around the idea of creativity because you can judge value quite cleanly whether you win or lose the game. It's when we get into the kind of messy world of kind of human artistic creativity that value will be a little harder to pin down. Now, the other thing that is important is why I regard this as the creativity of the code and not the humans who started the learning process. Because I think that if humans had actually identified that line of code, play on the 5th row in that early on in the game, they probably would have deleted it as a bad piece of learning. Certainly a Go master would slap your wrists if you played that move when you were learning to play the game. So this was a line of code that really emerged out of the learning process of the code as it engaged in more games and somehow learnt to play this game. So I think that's why we should regard that move 37 as the creativity of the code and not the human. And so for me, that really raises a very exciting possibility that this new sort of coding, this bottom-up coding, has the possibility to really do things which are creative, to surprise us and ultimately do things perhaps which have value. So I've been very interested in over the last few years to look at how this code is beginning to impact on the kind of messier world of human artistic creativity. And one place it has been incredibly successful, and a lot of people have had fun experimenting with this, is in visual creativity. And vision, as I said, was always something that was regarded as something quite difficult for code to achieve, to recognize what was in an image, for example. If you do it pixel by pixel, you'll never know. You have to have this ability to look at the picture as a whole. And that was traditionally very hard to write code in a top-down manner to do vision recognition. But the machine learning can actually just be given images, which it then is labeled images, and it learns somehow what characteristics make up the difference between a cat and a dog, for example. So vision recognition software has really been very successful in this age of machine learning bottom-up way of writing code. So if code can recognize images, how good was it at making its own images? Well, some of the very first examples were in taking an artist of the past, seeing whether AI could learn the style of that artist and then replicate it in a new image. There were some very interesting examples. Rembrandt, for example, there was a project where a company took all of Rembrandt's portraits, which there are quite a lot of, and that's one of the things you need is a lot of data to learn on. There were enough images for the AI to pick up the particular style of Rembrandt. And that's interesting because, if I show you an image, you'll probably be able to recognize it as Rembrandt because Rembrandt has particular qualities of the way he painted. So this is what the AI picks up on, is those kind of stylistic qualities that were unique to Rembrandt. And they were able to produce with this code a very convincing portrait, which I think most people will be very easily taken in by as being certainly in Rembrandt's style. Right? People said it didn't really have that kind of Rembrandt shudder about it. When you look at it, you didn't really feel it was slightly photographic almost in quality. But I still think it's pretty impressive that it was able to replicate that style. But of course, that's not really creativity. It's just kind of pastiche, something we've already seen. But then these vision recognition software were able to start creating things which I think were interestingly new and somehow a new style. One particular style of coding which I think has been very effective in actually pushing boundaries is something called a generative adversarial network, or a GAN. And this is sort of two algorithms working in competition almost against each other. One learns the style of the art of the past and then is tasked with trying to break that style. So it tries to make a painting which doesn't fit any of the parameters that it's kind of built up through its learning process of the art of the last 1,500 years. And then the second algorithm is called the discriminator algorithm, and it judges either, no, you haven't moved away from the style that we've seen in the past, this is too much like something I've seen already, or else you've moved too far and we really don't regard this as art. So it tries to find that sweet spot between new but not too new. And the GANs in the visual realm really produced some very interesting visuals which had their own particular style. And I think if you show somebody now an image and you say, two images and one's been created by a GAN, most people can recognize that there is a sort of computer style, an AI style to these images. There's slightly fuzzy in texture, but they are, I think, quite interesting because they are a sort of new style. I'm not sure they're aesthetically that exciting, but it's interesting, I think, because it's something that the AI has made it itself and would be recognizable as its own style. Since then, we've had incredibly successful pieces of software that I think a lot of people have enjoyed using, things like Dali and midjourney, and they sort of used that kind of fuzziness, but then sort of honed it back to something that we would recognize as a almost photographic, realistic image. And we've seen incredible images like the Pope in Gucci created by these pieces of software. So, and I think this new level of kind of visuals that's being produced, I think, is one of the things that has scared people because of the ability to create things which look so convincing and yet are fake. So just fake still images, but also videos as well. So I think these are the things which have slightly unsettled people, as the power of this technology actually to lead people astray. What I think is quite interesting about Dali and Midjourney is that the creativity there is slightly different because people, the prompt that people give is through words, and then those words trigger through the labeling of the images that the software has learnt on, a kind of fusion of images which match the words that you've put in. So weirdly, the creativity now is a kind of mixed creativity of the written word and visuals. And for a human, we engage with this piece of software by actually sort of writing poetry, and the creativity, actually, there is a kind of role of the human in this creative process, because the most interesting images are those that have been prompted by very interesting sequences of words. And there's almost like a new genre of artists, the artist who's able to create these prompts to make the code do something interesting and produce quite a surprising visual. So I think that's one of the exciting things, that AI is a bit like the invention of the camera. It's actually allowing us to do new things, and a kind of new art form emerging, which is this mix of the written word prompting and exploring what the code would produce with those images. But I actually think the images are not particularly interesting. They're things that we recognize. That's the point. They're meant to be things that are quite close to home. So I don't think they're actually artistically or creatively as interesting in a way to the GANs, which were producing something which was a unique sort of computer AI visual style. Weirdly, I think the most interesting visual experiment has produced visuals which I don't think are aesthetically beautiful at all, or artistically interesting, but I think actually go to the heart of what creativity for me really is about, which is about exploring the mind of the other. I rather like Carl Rogers' definition of creativity, that, you know, was the tool that humans developed in order to explore the mind of the other and our own inner emotional world, which when it first emerged must have been quite shocking. And so creativity is a way of exploring that and trying to empathize and share with others. So now we've got code which has its own inner world, which we really don't understand, because the code is so complex and dense that, you know, we really can't read the code line by line and get any idea of really how it's making its decisions. So we've got a real challenge going forward as we produce this very complex, rich code, trying to understand how it's making its decisions, which clearly are impacting quite severely on society, about deciding whether we get a job or a mortgage, or what sentence we get in court, for example. So knowing what's happening inside the code is going to be really important. And I think actually that creativity is a really interesting tool to probe the depth of that code. And one of the most interesting examples, I think, was Google's Deep Dream, where they took their vision recognition software and they were kind of interested to ask, well, okay, it's good at recognizing images, but what does it actually see? How is it seeing the world? And so what they did was sort of reverse the process, and they said, okay, we're going to give this piece of software a very fuzzy image, and then ask it to just accentuate visually anything that it sees inside that image. A little bit like when we look up at the sky and we see clouds, we naturally want to see something in the kind of fluffy clouds. We'll see an image of a dragon or a sheep or a face. So the same idea with Deep Dream. What does the AI actually see inside this kind of fuzzy mess of pixels? And so it would dial up and accentuate what it thought was in there. And the very striking thing is you started to see actually the learning process of the code, what it had seen and learnt about, which was a lot of images of animals, faces, eyes, mechanical equipment. So when the AI was allowed to dream and see what was inside these images, you started to get some impression of the learning process of the code and sort of how the AI was seeing the world. And this actually enabled us to pick up bad learning in this vision recognition software. For example, there was one case where it started to see dumbbells inside these fuzzy images. But when it drew the dumbbells, it always had an arm attached to the dumbbell. And what we realized was that the AI had never seen a dumbbell in its own right. It always seen dumbbells held by strong men and women. And so it learned somehow that the dumbbell was just an extension of our anatomy when we become strong. So I think asking AI to be creative actually is a kind of interesting way to explore the inner world of the code. It's certainly not conscious yet or anything, but it almost is like as a subconscious world which it isn't able to articulate. It's very hard to ask the AI to compress its decision-making process and explain why it did certain things. So I think creativity might well be more interesting, not just for stimulating human creativity, looking at new things, but actually understanding how the code is working. But for me, I think, we talk very often about AI taking over the world, the singularity, and I think this kind of misses a point. And I'm quite tech optimistic, really, and I think that these new tools really are tools that can help us as humans to do new things. And some of the most interesting examples have been where a human creative has taken some of this code and it's helped them in their process to move on to do something new. A very interesting example of this was a jazz pianist, Bernard Lubat in France, who helped train a piece of AI to improvise on jazz called the Jazz Continuator. And when he played with this piece of AI in a sort of call and response concert, his response was very interesting because he said, well, everything that AI is producing, I recognize. It's me. It's learnt on my style. But what it's playing is very new. It's not something I've ever thought about doing myself before, but it's really my sound world. So the AI had helped push Bernard Lubat out of his kind of comfort zone of playing and stimulated him to try new ways of playing. And I think that's one of the exciting things. Humans, we get very stuck in particular ways of behaving. I know I do that as a mathematician. I kind of repeat methods that have worked in the past and rely on that to make new progress. But I think we often get reduced into just behaving a bit like a machine, just repeating behaviors, repeating a particular way of playing or a visual style when you're painting. And the fact that the AI might look at what you're doing and say, hey, but there's other things that you can do with your world, has the chance actually to push us out of behaving like machines and perhaps might help us to be more creative again as humans. And I think that's one of the exciting ways that a creator can use AI as a sort of helpful collaborator in kind of pushing us into the new. I think recently the big progress has been with AI that can write. And I think this is quite striking because actually when I first started to think about AI creativity, I thought that writing might be one of the first things to be very good at. Because after all, there's a lot of writing to learn on and all the books we've written. And it's a fairly discrete sort of learning set to train on. But early on, the kind of text generation algorithms weren't particularly effective beyond a few sentences. But now the learning process, these learning models, large language models, have really shocked us, I think. I mean, the likes of GPT, ChatGPT, GPT-4, and GPT, I don't know how far we're going to go in the numbering, but I think people have been quite, impressed and shocked, excited and fearful of just how powerful these text generation algorithms are being, that, with just a very small prompt, you can get sort of an undergraduate essay, a pretty high level written for you, journalistic pieces are written by ChatGPT. Certainly it's got limitations at the moment. We know it hallucinates, it tries to make things up if it can't find what it's doing, but I think we're still being very impressed with kind of actually the level of text that's being generated by this. But one thing I've always felt has been lacking in text generation is a sense of overarching narrative, that these things are very local in their the way they generate things. So essentially it's looking at what's been written already and making a good guess based on its learning of what is likely to be an acceptable sentence following what has just appeared. And so that's, text which is being generated very locally, and certainly it's got a good memory, so it can write several pages of quite coherent text. But beyond a few pages, it starts to feel like it's meandering. It doesn't really know where it's going. And novelists who try to use this to actually write something sort of more long form, given it sort of plot ideas, plot developments, perhaps a spy novel where a particular person is a double agent, it generally blows that information very early on, whilst as a novelist you want to save that, kind of reveal that somebody is a double agent much later. So AI seems to be having quite a lot of difficulty with a kind of temporal element. It can locally keep things going, but globally it doesn't really know where it's going. It doesn't really have anything it wants to tell us, to say, maybe is what's holding it back. And I think you see this also in the music generation, that although the jazz continuator was very convincing, playing jazz that would be very acceptable on a kind of local level, within about 5 minutes, the music becomes really very boring because it sort of doesn't know where it's going. It's meandering. So I think that's what's interesting, a limitation at the moment. In vision, we've got still images, so there isn't that temporal element, and it's been very successful. But the text generation, the music, it's really, I think, only on a local level that it's working very well and doesn't have a sort of global sense of where it's going. And of course, that's at the heart of one of the problems with AI creativity. Bottom line is it's got no intention. The intention is still driven from the human who wants to make the AI do something, play a game of Go, produce an image. It's not got an internal world that it's desperate to express. However, I do think that if in the future we reach a moment where AI does pass another kind of phase change and has an inner world, who knows, that may be possible, has some level of consciousness, then probably its creativity is going to be the only way we'll know whether it's something genuinely interesting inside or whether actually it's faking it. Still, we've already had an example of somebody at Google who got so convinced by their text generation that they thought it had become conscious. Clearly this is silly at this level, but on the other hand, it raised an interesting question. At what point do we have to take this seriously? And probably then is when the AI will write its novel or will write the symphony which expresses just the whatever it is, the pain, the love, the ecstasy of something happening inside the code. And when and if that does emerge, I think that of course that consciousness is going to be very different from our own. And it's at that point where I think AI creativity is going to be an absolutely essential tool in, just as it was for early humans, I believe, in helping us to genuinely understand each other.